Jeremy appeared as promised. When the last thumbnail of sun winked out over the mountains beyond the meadow, Mrs. Frisby was waiting, her heart pounding in her ears, and 3 of the children were there to watch. Teresa and Martin standing beside their mother, and Cynthia, who was afraid of the crow, just a pair of round eyes peering out from the round doorway. Timothy was down below, taking a nap, and had not been told about the expedition, lest he worry and blame himself for the risk his mother must take. Indeed, the words moving day had not been mentioned in his presence. Even to the other children, Mrs. Frisby had explained only part of the problem. That is, she had not told them that there were only 5 days left, nor anything about Mr. Fitzgibbon and the tractor. She did not want to worry them either. Jeremy landed with a swoosh, a bit dramatically perhaps, and nodded at the children and Mrs. Frisby. "Hello," he said. "Here I am." Mrs. Frisby introduced Martin and Teresa, and Cynthia's eyes. Martin, who wished he were going on the trip himself, asked Jeremy in excitement, "How high can you fly?" "Oh, I don't know exactly," Jeremy said. "A couple of miles, I suppose." "Mother, did you hear? You'll be 2 miles up in the air." "Martin, it won't be necessary to go so high on this trip," Jeremy said cheerfully. "No, but I can if you like." "No, thank you. I wouldn't think of your taking the trouble." She was trying hard to hide her terror, and Martin had not helped matters at all. But Jeremy suddenly saw that she was trembling and realised she must be afraid. "It's all right," he said kindly. "There's nothing to be nervous about. I fly over the woods a dozen times a day." "Yes," thought Mrs. Frisby, "but you're not riding on your back, and you can't fall off." "All right," she said as bravely as she could. "I'm ready. Teresa and Martin, take care of Timothy until I come back, and be sure you don't tell him where I've gone." With a small leap she was on Jeremy's back, lying as flat as she could and holding tight to the glossy feathers between his wings, as a horse rider grips the horse's mane before a jump. Martin and Teresa waved goodbye, but she did not see them, for she had her face pressed against the feathers and her eyes closed. Once again she felt the surge of power as the crow's broad wings beat down against the air. This time it lasted longer, for they were going higher than before. Then the beating became gentler as they levelled off, and then, to her alarm, it stopped altogether. What was wrong? The crow must have felt her grow tense, for suddenly, from far ahead, she heard his voice. "An updraft," he said. "We're soaring. There's usually one over this stretch of woods in the evening." A current of warm air rising from the woods was carrying them along. So smooth was the motion that they seemed to stand still, and Mrs. Frisby ventured to open her eyes and lift her head just a trifle. But off to the right and a bit behind them, she saw a grey-brown square the size of a postage stamp. She realised with a gasp that it was the garden patch, and Martin and Teresa, if they were still there, were too small to be seen. "Look to the left," said Jeremy, who was watching her over his shoulder. She did, and saw what looked like a wide, fearsome snake, blue-green in colour, coiling through the woods. "What is it?" she asked in wonder. "You really don't know? It's the river." "Oh," said Mrs. Frisby, rather ashamed of her ignorance. She had heard of the river, of course, but had not known that it looked like a snake. She had never been there, since to reach it one had to cross the entire width of the forest. There were advantages to being a bird. In a minute more they had left the updraft, and Jeremy's wings resumed pumping. They went higher, and Mrs. Frisby closed her eyes again. When she opened them, the garden patch had vanished far behind them, and Jeremy, searching the trees below, began a long, slanting descent. Eventually, as he banked sharply, Mrs. Frisby saw off his wingtip a grey-brown patch amongst a group of tall green pines. From so high it looked like a gnarled grey bush, but as they circled lower she could see that it was in fact an enormous tree, leafless, skeletal and partly dead. One huge branch had recently broken off and fallen, and 3 pine trunks lay bent double under its weight. It was a gloomy and primeval spot, deeply shadowed in the grey dusk. Jeremy circled over it one more time, looking at a certain mark 3/4 of the way up the towering main trunk. Just below this spot, another great branch, itself as big as an ordinary tree, jutted out over the tops of the pines, and on this at last Jeremy fluttered gently to rest. They were some 10 feet from the main trunk, and Mrs. Frisby could see, just above the place where the branch joined the tree, a dark round hole, as large as a lunch plate. "We're here," said Jeremy in a low voice. "That's where he lives." "Should I get down?" Instinctively, Mrs. Frisby spoke in a whisper. "Yes, we got to walk closer, but quietly. He doesn't like loud noises. It's so high." She still clung to the crow's back. "But the limb is broad. You'll be safe enough." And indeed, the limb was almost as wide as a pavement. Mrs. Frisby gathered all her courage, slithered down, and felt the solid wood under her feet. Still, she could not help thinking about how far it was to the ground below. "There he is," said Jeremy, staring at the hole. "It's just the right time." They inched their way along the limb, Mrs. Frisby gripping the rough bark tightly, being careful not to stumble, and as they came closer, she could dimly perceive a shape like a squat vase, sitting back in the hollow of the tree. Near the top of the vase, wide apart, 2 round yellow eyes glowed in the dark. "You can't see us," Jeremy whispered. "It's still too light." Perhaps not, but he could hear, for now a deep round voice, a voice like an organ tone, echoed out of the hollow trunk. "Who is standing outside my house?" Jeremy answered. "Sir, I am a crow. My name is Jeremy, and I have brought you a friend. I hope we have not disturbed you. My friend needs your advice." "I see. And can your friend not speak for himself?" "Sir, my friend is a lady mouse." "A mouse?" The sonorous voice sounded unbelieving. "Why should a crow be a friend to a mouse?" "I was trapped, sir, and she set me free. She saved me from the cat." "That is possible," said the owl, "though unusual. I have heard of such a thing before. We all help one another against the cat." "True. And now, sir, my friend herself is in trouble." "I understand," said the owl, moving closer to the round entrance of his hollow. "Mrs. Mouse, I cannot see you, for the glare of the daylight is too bright. But if you step inside my house, I will listen to what you have to say." Mrs. Frisby hesitated. She knew something of the dietary habits of owls, and did not much like the idea of being trapped in his house. Finally, she said timidly, "Sir, I would not want to intrude, and I can hear you quite well from out here." "Mrs. Mouse, please understand that I have no interest at all, as a general rule, in helping mice to solve their problems. If you have indeed saved a bird from the cat, I will spare you a few minutes. But as I do not discuss problems with people I cannot see, either come inside or tell your friend to take you home again." Behind her, Mrs. Frisby heard Jeremy whisper very softly, "It's all right. He wouldn't harm you in his own home." She whispered back, "I hope not." She walked up the limb to the hollow, climbed over the sill, and stepped inside. Up close, the owl looked very large. Each of his feathery feet was tipped with 5 gleaming talons an inch long. His beak was curved sharply and cruel. He blinked his yellow eyes and said, "Please step across the room, away from the light." Mrs. Frisby did as she was told. As she grew accustomed to the dimness, she looked around her. The chamber into which she had stepped was spacious. At that level, almost half the huge trunk was hollow and clean, but the floor was extremely rough. It was not really a floor at all, but only the jagged ends of dead wood sticking up from below, like stalagmites in a cave, so that Mrs. Frisby had to climb rather than walk as she crossed the room. At the back the walls narrowed to a corner, and there she saw that the owl had built himself a nest, as big as a water bucket, of twigs and leaves. From the top she could see protruding some wisps of the feathers with which he had lined it. When she got near this nest, she stopped and faced the owl, who had turned from the light of the doorway and was peering at her with his great yellow eyes. Jeremy was nowhere to be seen. She could only hope he was still waiting on the limb outside. "Now," said the owl, "you may state your problem." Mrs. Frisby began nervously trying to arrange her thoughts. "It's about my youngest son, Timothy. He is sick, too sick to leave his bed, and moving day is only 5 days off." "Wait," said the owl. "Moving from where? Moving to where?" "From the garden patch where we're living to the edge of the pasture by the stream." "Which garden?" It had not occurred to Mrs. Frisby until now that a bird flying freely over miles of countryside would look down on many gardens. "It belongs to Mr. Fitzgibbon." "The one with the large stone?" "Yes, my house is near the stone." "What makes you so sure moving day will come in 5 days?" Mrs. Frisby told him about the tractor, and what Mr. Fitzgibbon had said. 5 days until ploughing. Of course, she added, it might turn cold again, and freeze, or even snow. "No," said the owl, sounding quite sure. "It will not. The wild onions are already up in the pastures." He asked her then what kind of house she had, and exactly where it was in relation to the big stone. Apparently he knew the spot well. But the more she talked to him, the more Mrs. Frisby became convinced he would produce no solution to her problem. It had been foolish of her to think he could, foolish of her to come at all. Because, she thought, there really was no solution. At last she fell silent, and the owl asked no more questions. Finally he said, "Lying where it does, your house will inevitably be turned up by the plough, and probably broken to bits in the process. There is no feasible way to prevent this. My only advice to you is this: if you stay in the house, you will surely be crushed and killed, all of you. Therefore, it is better to take your chances with moving. Wrap your son Timothy up as warmly as you can. Help him as much as possible on the journey, and hope for warm weather on moving day. That way, you are at least sure to save yourself and the other children." The owl paused, turned away from her, and looked again at the entrance to his hollow. The patch of light it admitted was growing steadily dimmer. "And now, if you will excuse me, the night is falling, and I have no more time to spare. I regret that I cannot give you a more satisfactory solution to your problem. Good evening, Mrs. He paused. "I don't believe you told me your name." "Mrs. Frisby." The poor mouse spoke with a sob in her throat, for the owl had said exactly what she feared he would say. And she had no real hope for Timothy. The owl had said, in effect, either Timothy alone must die, or they must all die together. Even if moving days should be extraordinarily warm, the nights were sure to be frosty, and that would be the end of him. Still, one must be polite, and she added sadly, "I thank you, sir, for listening to me." But at the mention of her name, an extraordinary change had come over the owl. He turned back to face her again, and stared at her most intently. Indeed, he gave an agitated flutter of his wings, and half flew, half hopped closer to her, bending forward, until his great sharp beak was only a few inches from her face. Mrs. Frisby shrank back in fear. What had she done wrong? "Did you say Mrs. Frisby?" "Yes, you asked my name." "Related to Jonathan Frisby?" "Yes, he was my husband. He died last summer." He was Timothy's father. But how did you know about him?
That is not important,
said the owl, drawing back a little and looking at her in a new way, almost as if with deference.
I will say this. His name was not unknown in these woods, and if you are his widow, that puts matters in a different light.
Something in the way he said it caused Mrs. Frisby's hopes to lift a little. What do you mean? She asked.
I mean, madam, that there is a way that your son's life might just possibly be saved. I did not mention it to you, because I saw no way you could conceivably do it, and I did not want to arouse false hope. But if you are Jonathan Frisby's widow, then perhaps it can be done.
I don't understand at all, said Mrs. Frisby. What is this thing?
It is not a thing I can do myself. You must go to the rats.
To the rats? But I don't know any rats. They have nothing to do with me.
I don't doubt that. They have nothing to do with anyone except themselves, and they will have less as time goes on. Nonetheless, I think they will help you, and if they will, they can.
But what can they do?
They must move your house to a place where it will be safe from the plough.
Now Mrs. Frisby's spirits fell again. She said, almost bitterly, You're joking, sir. You're not serious. No rat could move my house. It's far too heavy, much too big.
The rats on Mr. Fitzgibbon's farm have things, ways you know nothing about. They are not like the rest of us. They are not, I think, even like most other rats. They work at night, in secret. Mrs. Frisby, do you know their main entrance?
In the rose bush, yes.
Go there. You will find a sentry guarding the door. His name is Justin. Tell him who you are, and that you came at my request. Tell him you want to see a rat named Nicodemus. I think they will let you in, though they may insist on swearing you to secrecy. If they should ask that, you must, of course, use your own judgment, but my advice would be to do as they ask.
Mrs. Frisby was close to complete bewilderment. Secrecy, she said. Secrecy about what?
That I cannot reveal. I too have agreed to it. Also, there is much I do not know, though I have given advice on certain aspects of their projects.
Well, said Mrs. Frisby, I don't understand at all, but if it might save Timothy, I'll try to do what you say.
Tell them, added the owl, that I suggest moving the house to the lee of the stone. Remember that, the lee of the stone. Also, do not forget the names, Justin and Nicodemus.
Justin, Nicodemus, the lee of the stone, repeated Mrs. Frisby. I will remember. She was now so entirely puzzled that she did not think to ask what the phrase meant. Presumably, the rats would know.
And Mrs. Frisby, said the owl, moving again towards the entrance of the hollow, please understand. I was an admirer of your late husband, although I never met him in person. I wish you well. I hope your son's life can be saved. You see, I can understand your particular need, for I face a similar problem.
You, said Mrs. Frisby, but you have no moving day.
I have lived in this tree, in this same hollow, the owl said, for more years than anyone can remember. But now, when the wind blows hard in winter and rocks the forest, I sit here in the dark, and from deep down in the bole, down near the roots, I hear a new sound. It is the sound of strands of wood creaking in the cold and snapping one by one. The limbs are falling. The tree is old, and it is dying. Yet I cannot bring myself after so many years to leave, to find a new home and move into it, perhaps to fight for it. I, too, have grown old. One of these days, one of these years, the tree will fall, and when it does, if I am still alive, I will fall with it.
With this sad prediction, the owl stepped through his doorway, spread his great wings and was gone, soaring silently downward into the shadowy woods below. Mrs. Frisby followed him out onto the limb. To her relief, Jeremy was still waiting where she had left him, though not very patiently.
"We must hurry," he said. "It's almost dark. I'm not supposed to be out so late."
Mrs. Frisby, who had the same feeling, climbed on his back, much less afraid now for two reasons. First, she was getting used to air travel. Second, since the woods below them were dark, she could no longer see how far away the ground was.
"He talked to you for a long time," said Jeremy as they flew. "Did he tell you anything that will help?"
"I don't know," said Mrs. Frisby. Since the owl had brought up the matter of secrecy, and had, in fact, been secretive himself, she was not sure just how much she should tell Jeremy.
"Why don't you know?"
"I mean, he told me some things, but I don't know whether they'll help or not." She decided to counter with a question of her own. What does "in the lee" mean? Jeremy, being like all birds knowledgeable about the wind, knew the answer to that.
"It means the calm side, the side the wind doesn't blow from. When there's a strong wind, you fly up to the barn from the lee so you don't get bashed into the wall. My father taught me that."
"I see," said Mrs. Frisby, and she became more puzzled than ever. What had the wind got to do with it? "He told me," she said finally, deciding it could do no harm, "to go and see the rats."
"The rats?"
Jeremy was startled.
"They don't have anything to do with us."
"I know, but he thought they might help."
"What could they do?"
"He thought they might move my whole house, but how they could do it, I can't imagine."
"Oh, I don't doubt they could," said Jeremy. "Everyone knows, at least all the birds know, that the rats can do things. They're up to something. Nobody's quite sure what. For one thing, they're building themselves a new house, way back in the woods over the mountains. They've made quite a big clearing near it. I'd show you, but it's too dark now. They used to carry food like the rest of us, but now we see them with other things, pieces of metal, bits of machinery, and things I can't even recognize. They take them into that rose bush, and what happens to them I don't know. But the owl knows more than most. I expect he's had some dealings with them. Just the same, I never heard of them helping anybody but themselves."
"Neither have I, but I'm going to ask them anyway. There isn't anyone else to ask." By the time they reached the garden, it had gone almost completely dark, and Jeremy could not linger. "Good night, Jeremy," said Mrs. Frisby, feeling almost affectionate towards the crow. "Thank you for taking me, and for waiting to bring me back."
"You're welcome," said Jeremy. "If you ever need me again, just ask. After all, if it weren't for you, I wouldn't be here to ask."
And he flew off into the darkness, the last crow to get home that night.